The grand ballroom of Buckingham Manor sparkled under the crystal chandeliers as King Edward VII prepared for what would become one of the most talked-about evenings in recent royal history. The annual Royal Charity Gala was in full swing, with hundreds of distinguished guests mingling among the marble columns and gilded walls. But tonight, something felt different in the air, a tension that even the most carefully orchestrated royal protocol couldn't mask. King Edward stood near the main entrance, his tall frame imposing in his formal evening wear. At 68, he carried himself with the dignity expected of a monarch, though those who knew him well could see the weariness in his eyes. The weight of the crown had grown heavier in recent years, especially since the scandals that had rocked the royal family. His marriage to Queen Isabella had been the subject of intense media scrutiny, and, tonight, that scrutiny felt particularly sharp. Across the room, Princess Catherine moved gracefully through the crowd, her emerald gown catching the light with every step. At 35, she had become the darling of the British public, elegant, compassionate, and genuinely committed to her charitable work. Her marriage to Prince William had been a fairy tale come true, and together they had restored much of the royal family's tarnished reputation. Catherine had a natural warmth that drew people to her, and tonight was no exception as she stopped to speak with various charity representatives and donors. Queen Isabella, meanwhile, maintained her position near the royal table, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her blue gown impeccable. At 62, she had spent decades learning to navigate the complexities of royal life, but her relationship with the public had never been easy. Many still remembered the circumstances of her marriage to Edward, how it had come after years of controversy and public disapproval. She had worked tirelessly to earn acceptance, but there remained an invisible barrier between her and the people's hearts. The evening's program included several speeches about the various charities being supported, and as the time for the royal address approached, King Edward felt the familiar weight of expectation. He had delivered thousands of speeches over his reign, but tonight felt different. Perhaps it was the letter he had received that morning from his private secretary, detailing the latest polling numbers about public opinion regarding the monarchy. Or perhaps it was the conversation he had overheard between two cabinet ministers about the need for the royal family to modernize or risk irrelevance. As the master of ceremonies called for attention, the ballroom gradually quieted. King Edward stepped forward to the podium, his hands trembling slightly, a detail that would not go unnoticed by the keen-eyed photographers present. He began his speech with the usual formalities, thanking the guests for their generous support of the evening's charitable causes. His voice was steady, but those closest to him noticed something in his demeanor that seemed almost vulnerable. "Ladies and gentlemen," King Edward continued, "tonight we gather not just as supporters of worthy causes, but as a community united in our desire to serve others. The monarchy has always been about service, service to the nation, service to the Commonwealth, and service to ideals greater than ourselves." As he spoke, his eyes briefly scanned the room, taking in the faces of the assembled guests. Near the front, he could see Catherine listening intently, her expression one of genuine interest and support. Further back, Queen Isabella maintained her composed smile, though Edward noticed the slight tension in her posture that suggested she, too, felt the undercurrents of the evening. "Change is not something we should fear," the king continued, his voice gaining strength. "Rather, it is something we must embrace if we are to remain relevant and meaningful in the lives of our people. The crown must evolve, just as our society evolves, while maintaining the timeless values that have sustained us for generations." There was a subtle murmur in the crowd at these words. Talk of change from the monarchy was always noteworthy, but coming at this particular moment, it felt especially significant. Royal correspondents in attendance were already mentally drafting their reports, sensing that this might be more than just another charitable gala speech. As King Edward concluded his remarks and the polite applause filled the ballroom, the evening's formal program gave way to more relaxed mingling. It was during this transition that the moment occurred which would become the subject of intense speculation and analysis in the days to come. A group of photographers had been granted permission to take some informal photos of the royal family members interacting with guests. As they positioned themselves for what was meant to be a routine shot, King Edward found himself in conversation with several charity directors near where Catherine was standing. Queen Isabella was speaking with a different group several feet away. The conversation was animated and positive, with Catherine sharing details about a new initiative she was launching to support disadvantaged children. Her passion for the cause was evident, and King Edward found himself genuinely engaged in learning about her plans. As she described the project's potential impact, she gestured enthusiastically, her face lighting up with the kind of authentic emotion that had made her so beloved by the public. It was in this moment of genuine connection and shared purpose that something shifted in King Edward's expression. Perhaps it was Catherine's obvious dedication, or perhaps it was the stark contrast he felt between this authentic interaction and the more formal exchanges he typically shared with his wife. Whatever the cause, he found himself drawn to Catherine's warmth and sincerity in a way that transcended the usual royal protocols. As the photographers began taking their shots, King Edward instinctively stepped closer to Catherine, his body language open and engaged. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a reaching out that went beyond mere professional courtesy. For just a moment, it seemed as though he was seeking something more than just conversation, perhaps understanding, perhaps connection, or perhaps simply the comfort of being around someone whose presence felt genuinely uplifting. Queen Isabella, from her position across the small gathering, noticed the interaction immediately. Her years of royal training had taught her to observe everything while appearing to focus on her immediate conversation. She saw the way her husband leaned slightly toward Catherine, the animation in his expression, and the ease with which they communicated. It was a stark contrast to the more measured interactions she and Edward typically shared, even in private. The photographers captured several images in quick succession, their cameras clicking rapidly as they sought to document what appeared to be a warm family moment. But those with more experienced eyes, the veteran royal correspondents and seasoned palace staff, recognized that something more complex was unfolding before them. Catherine, for her part, seemed unaware of any undercurrents to the moment. She was focused on her charitable work and appreciated having the king's attention and support for her initiatives. Her responses were warm but appropriate, maintaining the respectful distance that royal protocol demanded while still engaging authentically with Edward's questions and comments. But the moment stretched just a beat too long, and the silence that followed Edward's reaching gesture became notable. Queen Isabella's conversation partner had to repeat a question to regain her attention, and several other guests in the immediate vicinity seemed to sense that something significant had occurred, though they couldn't quite identify what it was. The palace staff, trained to read such moments, began to subtly guide the royal family members toward different areas of the ballroom, following the evening's planned schedule. But the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. The photographers had their images, the observers had their impressions, and Queen Isabella had her confirmation of something she had long suspected but never acknowledged. As the evening continued, the three principals in this subtle drama each processed what had occurred in their own way. King Edward found himself reflecting on the contrast between duty and desire, between the relationships that protocol demanded and those that felt natural and life-giving. Catherine remained focused on her charitable work, but couldn't shake the feeling that something important had shifted in the family dynamics, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Queen Isabella, meanwhile, maintained her composure throughout the remainder of the evening, but inside she was grappling with a complex mix of emotions. Years of marriage to Edward had taught her to recognize the signs of his emotional state, and what she had witnessed tonight confirmed fears she had harbored but never spoken aloud. The reaching gesture, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at Catherine, the ease of their interaction, all of it painted a picture that was both painful and unsurprising. As the gala wound down and the royal family prepared to make their departures, the usual pleasantries were exchanged, but those familiar with royal behavior could detect subtle changes in the dynamics. Edward's goodbyes to Catherine were perhaps a moment longer than protocol suggested, while his interactions with Isabella carried a slightly formal quality that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening. The drive back to the palace was quiet, with Edward and Isabella each lost in their own thoughts. The silence between them wasn't unusual. After decades of marriage, they had become comfortable with their own mental space during such transitions. But tonight, the silence carried additional weight, heavy with unspoken understanding and unacknowledged truth. Back at the palace, as the king and queen retired to their separate suites, an arrangement that had become standard in recent years, each began the private process of dealing with what the evening had revealed. Edward found himself at his desk, ostensibly reviewing papers, but actually staring out the window at the palace gardens, thinking about connections and choices, duty and desire. In her suite, Isabella sat before her mirror as her lady-in-waiting helped remove her jewelry and began the process of preparing her for bed. But her mind was far from such mundane concerns. She was thinking about photographs that would likely appear in tomorrow's papers, about the subtle but unmistakable message that Edward's behavior had sent, and about the long, complicated road that had led them all to this moment. The evening had started as just another royal obligation, one of hundreds they fulfilled each year in service to various causes and organizations. But it had ended as something much more significant, a moment of truth that would reverberate through the royal family and beyond, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about duty, love, and the price of living life in the public eye. As the palace settled into its nighttime quiet, the three people at the center of the evening's drama each faced their own private reckoning with what had occurred and what it might mean for their futures. The silence that had followed Edward's reaching gesture toward Catherine would prove to be far more eloquent than any words could have been, speaking volumes about the complexities of royal relationships and the human hearts that beat beneath the crowns and titles. The stage was set for revelations and reckonings that would test not just individual relationships, but the very foundations of the monarchy itself. What had seemed like a simple charitable gala would be remembered as the night when carefully maintained facades began to crack, allowing glimpses of the very human drama playing out behind palace walls. The morning papers would carry the photographs, the royal correspondents would begin their analysis, and the public would start to sense that something significant was shifting in the family they followed with such intense interest. But, for now, in the quiet hours of the night, three people struggled with the weight of truth and the complexity of emotions that no amount of royal training could fully prepare them to handle. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult conversations, but tonight, in the aftermath of that moment of reaching and the silence that followed, each of them began to confront the reality that their carefully constructed royal lives might be about to change in ways none of them could fully predict or control. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of King Edward's private study as he sat with his morning tea, surrounded by newspapers that told a story he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The headlines weren't scandalous. The royal press office had done their job well. But the photographs spoke a language that transcended words. There he was, captured in that moment of reaching toward Catherine, his expression open and genuinely warm in a way that royal observers hadn't seen in years. A royal connection. King Edward and Princess Catherine share a moment at charity gala, read the most generous headline. Others were more subtle but no less pointed, the king's warm welcome and royal family unity on display. But it wasn't the headlines that concerned Edward, it was the photographs themselves and what they revealed about his own state of mind. His private secretary, James Morrison, entered the study carrying additional newspapers and wearing the carefully neutral expression that palace staff had perfected over decades of service. James had worked for the royal family for 15 years and had developed an ability to gauge the mood and implications of any situation with remarkable accuracy. Your Majesty, James began carefully. The coverage is quite positive overall. The charitable aspects of the evening are being emphasized, and the public response to Princess Catherine's new initiative has been overwhelmingly supportive. Edward looked up from the newspaper he had been studying, noting the diplomatic way James had framed the situation. But, he prompted, knowing his secretary well enough to recognize when something was being left unsaid. Well, sir, there has been some discussion among the royal correspondents about the family dynamics displayed last evening. Nothing inappropriate, of course, but there's a general sense that the public is particularly drawn to the warmth of interaction between yourself and Princess Catherine. Edward set down his teacup and leaned back in his chair, considering the implications of James's carefully chosen words. The royal family lived under constant scrutiny, and every gesture, every glance, every moment of interaction was analyzed and interpreted by a media apparatus that had grown increasingly sophisticated over the years. Have you spoken with Princess Catherine's office this morning? Edward asked. Yes, sir. Her private secretary mentioned that she's received several interview requests specifically about the initiative she discussed with you last evening. The media interest seems to be focusing on her charitable work, but there's also curiosity about her role within the broader royal family. As they spoke, Queen Isabella was in her own morning routine 3 floors above, but her usual sense of calm had been replaced by a restless energy that her staff couldn't help but notice. Lady Margaret Thornton, her long-serving lady-in-waiting, had worked with the Queen for over a decade and could read her moods better than most people could read books. "Ma'am," Lady Margaret ventured as she helped Isabella with her correspondence. "Shall I adjust your schedule for today? There have been several requests from various organizations following last night's gala." Isabella paused in reviewing an invitation to a museum opening, her mind clearly elsewhere. "What sort of requests?" "Several charities are hoping to arrange meetings to discuss potential royal patronage. There's also been interest from the media in scheduling interviews about your upcoming initiatives." The irony wasn't lost on Isabella that the same event that had created such personal turmoil for her was also generating the kind of positive attention that the monarchy desperately needed. Public opinion polls had shown declining support for the royal family in recent months, and successful charitable events like last night's gala were essential for maintaining their relevance and public approval. "Schedule the charity meetings," Isabella decided. "But hold off on the media requests for now. I want to see how the coverage develops over the next few days." Meanwhile, at Kensington Palace, Catherine was dealing with her own version of the morning's complications. Her private secretary, Sarah Collins, had arrived early with news that Catherine's charitable initiative was receiving unprecedented attention, but the focus wasn't entirely on the charitable aspects. "The good news," Sarah explained as they reviewed the morning's coverage together, "is that your children's education program is getting exactly the kind of visibility we hoped for. 3 major foundations have already called to discuss potential partnerships." Catherine smiled, genuinely pleased that her work was gaining traction. The program she had described to King Edward the previous evening was something she had been developing for months, a comprehensive approach to providing educational support for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Having the King's public interest and support could make a significant difference in attracting funding and institutional backing. "What's the less good news?" Catherine asked, recognizing the same diplomatic tone that seemed to characterize all palace communications. "Well, there's been quite a bit of commentary about the warmth of your interaction with His Majesty last evening. Royal correspondents are noting what they're calling evident mutual respect and clear family harmony." Catherine frowned slightly, not entirely sure why this would be problematic. "Isn't family harmony something we should want to project?" Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "Of course, ma'am. It's just that some of the coverage is making comparisons between different family relationships, and there's speculation about the dynamics within the senior royal family." The truth that Sarah was delicately avoiding was that several royal correspondents had begun to write pieces about the contrast between the easy warmth that King Edward had displayed with Catherine and the more formal interactions he typically had with Queen Isabella. It was the kind of observation that could quickly evolve from innocent royal watching into more problematic speculation about marriage dynamics and family tensions. Back at Buckingham Palace, King Edward found himself facing an unexpected visitor. Prince William had arrived unannounced, something that rarely happened given the complex logistics of royal schedules. Edward's security detail had admitted him immediately, recognizing both his status and the slight urgency in his manner. "Father," William began, using the informal title that they employed in private settings, "I thought we should discuss last evening's event." Edward gestured for his son to take a seat, noting the serious expression that suggested this wasn't a social call. William, now 38 and increasingly involved in senior royal duties, had developed a keen awareness of how public perception could impact the monarchy's future. "I've been reviewing the coverage with my staff," William continued, "and while the charitable aspects are being well received, there are some undercurrents that might require attention." "Such as?" Edward prompted, though he suspected he knew where this conversation was heading. "The photographs from last evening are being analyzed quite thoroughly by royal correspondents. There's particular focus on your interaction with Catherine, and some commentary about what they're calling evident family chemistry." Edward felt a familiar weight settling in his chest. The irony of being criticized for having a positive relationship with his daughter-in-law wasn't lost on him, but he understood the delicate nature of royal optics. Every gesture was subject to interpretation, and apparently, warmth and genuine interest could be just as problematic as coldness and disinterest. Catherine was discussing an important charitable initiative, Edward said carefully. "I was showing appropriate interest and support for her work." "Of course," William agreed. "And that support means a great deal to her and to the success of her programs. It's just that the media is beginning to draw comparisons between your interactions with different family members, and that could become complicated." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with father and son navigating the complex terrain of royal relationships, public perception, and family dynamics. By the end of it, Edward found himself agreeing to be more conscious of how his interactions might be perceived, while William committed to working with his staff to ensure that Catherine's charitable work remained the focus of media attention. After William left, Edward sat alone in his study, contemplating the strange reality of a life where genuine human connection could become a liability. The reaching gesture that had felt so natural the night before now seemed fraught with complications and potential misinterpretations. That afternoon, as fate would have it, both King Edward and Queen Isabella found themselves attending the same briefing about upcoming royal engagements. It was a routine meeting that occurred monthly, designed to coordinate schedules and ensure that the senior royals were properly supporting each other's initiatives. The meeting was held in the palace's blue drawing room, with various private secretaries and royal staff members present to discuss logistics and timing. Edward and Isabella sat across from each other at the polished mahogany table, maintaining the professional demeanor that had characterized their working relationship for years. As they reviewed the upcoming calendar, it became clear that several events would require them to appear together publicly, including a state dinner for visiting dignitaries and a memorial service for a deceased ambassador. The normal coordination of such events took on additional complexity given the morning's newspaper coverage and the subtle shift in family dynamics that everyone could sense but no one was willing to acknowledge directly. The state dinner will require the usual receiving line protocol, James Morrison explained, consulting his detailed notes. Their Majesties will greet each guest individually, followed by the other senior royals. Isabella nodded, making notes in her own calendar, but Edward noticed a slight tension in her posture that hadn't been there in previous meetings. The formal protocol that had always governed their public appearances now felt somehow different, weighted with unspoken understanding about what had been revealed the previous evening. What about the seating arrangements? Isabella asked, her voice maintaining its usual professional tone. Princess Catherine will be seated with the diplomatic delegation, given her upcoming trip to represent the royal family at the Children's Education Summit, James replied. The mention of Catherine's name created a momentary pause in the conversation, so brief that most people in the room probably didn't notice it. But Edward and Isabella both felt it, a small acknowledgement of the presence that had somehow become central to their current situation. As the meeting concluded and the staff members gathered their papers and began to file out, Edward and Isabella found themselves alone in the drawing room for the first time since the previous evening's gala. The silence that had characterized their drive home the night before seemed to return, filling the elegant room with unspoken tension. The charitable response has been quite positive, Isabella said finally, her words carefully neutral. Yes, it has been, Edward replied, recognizing the olive branch inherent in her comment while also hearing the subtle question underneath it. They stood there for a moment, two people who had shared decades of marriage and royal duty, each aware that something fundamental had shifted but neither quite ready to address it directly. The reaching gesture from the night before hung in the air between them, unmentioned but unmistakably present. I should review the guest list for next week's garden party, Isabella said eventually, gathering her papers and moving toward the door. Of course, Edward agreed, watching as she left the room with the dignity and composure that had defined her public persona for years. But, as the door closed behind her, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that they had just had their first real conversation about what had happened the night before, even though neither of them had said anything explicit about it. The silence that had followed his reaching gesture toward Catherine was proving to be remarkably eloquent, continuing to communicate truths that words couldn't safely express. That evening, as the palace settled into its nighttime routine, each of the principal players in this unfolding drama found themselves dealing with the day's revelations in their own way. Edward stood at his study window, looking out at the same garden view that had occupied his attention the night before, but now his thoughts were more focused on consequences and choices. Isabella, in her private sitting room, found herself looking through photo albums that documented decades of royal life, official portraits, charity events, state visits, and family gatherings. The images told the story of a life lived in service to duty and tradition, but also of relationships that had evolved and changed in ways that hadn't always been easy or natural. And Catherine, at Kensington Palace, was reviewing the positive response to her charitable initiative while trying to understand why her staff seemed to think there were complications arising from what had seemed like a straightforward conversation with her father-in-law about important work. The photographs from the gala would appear in magazines and newspapers for days to come, analyzed and interpreted by royal watchers and casual observers alike. But the real impact of that moment of reaching and the silence that had followed was being felt in the private thoughts and personal reflections of the people who had lived it. As the second day after the gala came to a close, it was becoming clear that what had seemed like a simple gesture of interest and support had opened a door to questions and considerations that would not be easily answered. The royal family was about to enter a period of intense scrutiny, not just from the media and the public, but from themselves as they grappled with the human emotions that existed beneath their royal titles and public duties. The stage was being set for conversations that had been avoided for years, decisions that had been postponed, and truths that had been carefully managed. The reaching gesture had been brief, but its implications would prove to be far more lasting than anyone could have anticipated in that moment of warmth and connection at a charity gala that was supposed to be just another royal obligation. 2 weeks had passed since the charity gala, and the ripple effects of that evening continued to spread through the royal family, like cracks in ancient marble. King Edward found himself increasingly aware of every interaction, every glance, every moment of connection that might be observed and interpreted by the ever-watchful media. What had once been natural behavior now felt calculated and measured, as if he were performing rather than simply being himself. The morning brought news that would complicate matters further. James Morrison entered the king's study carrying a thick folder of correspondence and wearing an expression that Edward had learned to associate with particularly delicate situations. "Your Majesty," James began, settling into the chair across from Edward's desk, "we've received a request that requires some careful consideration." Edward looked up from the constitutional papers he had been reviewing, noting the diplomatic tone that usually preceded complicated discussions. "What sort of request?" "The BBC has proposed a documentary about the modern monarchy, with particular focus on the charitable work being done by the royal family. They're requesting extensive interviews with yourself, the Queen, and Princess Catherine, among others." The request itself wasn't unusual. The royal family regularly participated in documentaries and media projects designed to showcase their work and maintain public engagement. But the timing, coming so soon after the gala and its aftermath, made the proposal particularly complex. "What's their specific interest in Catherine's work?" Edward asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "They want to explore what they're calling the new generation of royal charity work and how it's breathing fresh life into traditional institutions. Princess Catherine's education initiative is apparently central to their narrative." Edward leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. A documentary that focused heavily on Catherine's work would naturally require significant interaction between them during filming. The very thing that had created the current delicate situation would be magnified and broadcast to millions of viewers. They're also interested in exploring what they term the personal connections that make royal charity work authentic, James continued carefully. They want to show the genuine relationships between family members and how that translates into effective public service. The irony was unmistakable. The documentary makers wanted to capture exactly the kind of genuine warmth and connection that had created their current complications, seemingly unaware that what they viewed as positive storytelling material was the source of significant private tension. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella was dealing with her own set of challenges. Lady Margaret had arrived with news that several long-planned royal engagements would require adjustments due to scheduling conflicts. But the real issue was more subtle and more personal. "Ma'am," Lady Margaret began as they reviewed the week's calendar, "there's been an increase in media requests specifically about your role in various charitable organizations. Several publications want to do feature stories about your contributions to the arts and cultural preservation." Isabella looked up from her correspondence, recognizing the subtext of Lady Margaret's words. The increased media interest in her work wasn't necessarily about genuine curiosity regarding arts patronage. It was about providing balance and coverage that had been focusing heavily on Catherine's initiatives. "They're trying to ensure equal coverage," Isabella observed, her tone neutral but her understanding clear. "It appears so, ma'am. There seems to be a conscious effort to highlight the breadth of charitable work being done by all members of the royal family." The diplomatic language couldn't disguise the underlying reality. The media had picked up on the subtle shift in family dynamics, and were now working to maintain what they saw as appropriate balance, apparently unaware that their efforts to be fair and comprehensive were actually highlighting the very divisions they were trying to avoid acknowledging. That afternoon, Catherine found herself in a meeting that she hadn't expected to be particularly significant, but which would prove to be a turning point in the evolving situation. She had been invited to the palace for what was described as a routine briefing about her upcoming international trip to represent the royal family at an education summit. The meeting was held in one of the palace's smaller conference rooms, with representatives from the Foreign Office, her own staff, and several royal household officials present to discuss logistics, security, and diplomatic protocols. Catherine had participated in many such briefings over the years and approached this one with her usual thorough preparation and professional focus. What she hadn't expected was for King Edward to join the meeting halfway through the discussion about her presentation to the International Education Consortium. His presence wasn't unusual. Senior royals often attended briefings related to family members' overseas work, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested this was more than routine oversight. "Princess Catherine," he said as he took his seat at the conference table, "I understand you've been developing some innovative approaches to the education challenges we discussed at the gala." The reference to their conversation that evening was subtle but unmistakable, and everyone in the room could sense the particular attention that the king was paying to Catherine's work. Her presentation about creating sustainable educational partnerships between British institutions and international development programs was impressive and well-researched, but it was the interaction between Catherine and Edward during the question period that would be remembered by those present. "The sustainability model you've proposed," Edward said, leaning forward slightly as he studied the documents Catherine had prepared, "reminds me of some of the long-term thinking we've been trying to implement in other areas of royal charitable work. How do you envision scaling this approach?" Catherine's response was detailed and thoughtful, but what struck the observers in the room was the ease of communication between them and the genuine intellectual engagement that characterized their discussion. It was clear that Edward wasn't just being politely supportive. He was genuinely interested in and impressed by Catherine's strategic thinking. The meeting continued for another hour, covering security protocols, diplomatic expectations, and media management for the international trip. But the underlying dynamic between Edward and Catherine continued to be a noticeable element, creating a subtle tension that the other attendees could feel but couldn't quite identify. As the meeting concluded and people began gathering their papers and preparing to leave, Edward made a comment that would later be analyzed and discussed by palace staff for its implications. "Princess Catherine," he said as she packed up her presentation materials, "your approach to these educational challenges shows exactly the kind of forward-thinking leadership that will keep the monarchy relevant for future generations." The compliment was professional and appropriate, but delivered with a warmth and conviction that went beyond mere diplomatic courtesy. Several people in the room exchanged glances, recognizing that they had witnessed something that felt more personal than the usual royal family interactions. After Catherine left the palace that afternoon, she found herself reflecting on the meeting and the particular attention that King Edward had paid to her work. While she appreciated his support and was genuinely grateful for his interest in her charitable initiatives, she couldn't shake the feeling that something more complex was happening beneath the surface of their professional relationship. That evening, she mentioned the meeting to Prince William during their private dinner at Kensington Palace. Her description of the briefing and Edward's participation was factual and positive, but William picked up on subtle undertones that concerned him. "Father seemed particularly engaged with your education work," William observed carefully. "Yes, he was very supportive and asked excellent questions about the implementation strategy," Catherine replied. "It's wonderful to have that level of backing from the senior royal family." William nodded, but privately he was beginning to worry about the cumulative effect of these interactions and the attention they were generating both within the family and in the media. The documentary request that had come through official channels, the increased media focus on Catherine's charitable work, and now his father's growing involvement in her projects all pointed toward a situation that was becoming more complicated rather than less so. Meanwhile, at the palace, Queen Isabella was having her own moment of realization. Lady Margaret had left for the evening, and Isabella found herself alone in her private sitting room with the day's correspondence and a growing sense that the situation was evolving beyond her ability to manage it through quiet dignity and patient endurance. She had received a personal letter that afternoon from a longtime friend, Lady Victoria Pemberton, who moved in the same social circles as many of the guests from the charity gala. Victoria's letter was warm and congratulatory about the gala's success, but included a paragraph that Isabella had read several times. The photographs from the evening were lovely, my dear. One can see how genuinely committed Edward has become to supporting Catherine's charitable endeavors. The warmth of his interest in her work was quite evident, and it's wonderful to see such authentic family connection. I do hope you're feeling well. You seemed a bit tired in some of the later photographs. The letter was well-intentioned and affectionate, written by a friend who had no idea of the complications her observations might create. But, for Isabella, it confirmed that the subtle dynamics of that evening at the gala were being noticed and discussed by people whose opinions mattered in their social and political circles. As she sat with Victoria's letter, Isabella found herself confronting truths that she had been avoiding for months, if not years. Her marriage to Edward had never been the fairy tale romance that the public sometimes imagined royal relationships to be. It had been a union based on compatibility, shared duty, and mutual respect, but the passionate connection that people hoped to see in their royal family had never quite materialized. The contrast with Edward's evident enthusiasm for his interactions with Catherine was becoming impossible to ignore. It wasn't that Isabella suspected anything inappropriate. She knew both Edward and Catherine to be people of strong character and deep commitment to their duties. But the vitality and genuine warmth that Edward displayed when discussing Catherine's work was something that had been missing from their own relationship for longer than Isabella cared to acknowledge. That same evening, Edward was in his study, ostensibly reviewing briefing papers for the next day's engagements, but actually thinking about the meeting that afternoon and the documentary request that would require an answer soon. The proposal to showcase the royal family's charitable work offered an opportunity to highlight important causes and demonstrate the monarchy's continued relevance, but it also presented risks that he was only beginning to fully understand. The reaching gesture from the gala had been spontaneous and natural, arising from genuine interest in Catherine's work and admiration for her commitment to meaningful causes. But in the 2 weeks since that evening, Edward had become increasingly aware that his feelings about his daughter-in-law were more complex than simple familial affection and professional respect. Catherine represented something that Edward felt had been missing from his life for years: authentic passion for charitable work, intellectual curiosity, and a natural warmth that made every interaction feel meaningful rather than merely dutiful. When they discussed her educational initiatives or other charitable projects, Edward felt energized and engaged in a way that reminded him of why he had once been enthusiastic about royal service. The documentary would inevitably capture these interactions and broadcast them to a global audience, potentially magnifying the very dynamics that were already creating complications within the family. But refusing to participate would raise questions about royal unity and could damage the causes that Catherine was working so hard to support. As the palace settled into its nighttime quiet, each of the principal figures in this unfolding drama was grappling with decisions and realizations that would shape not just their personal relationships, but the future of the monarchy itself. The reaching gesture from the charity gala continued to reverberate through their lives, forcing confrontations with truths that had been carefully managed and emotions that had been diplomatically suppressed. Isabella was facing the reality that her marriage, while stable and dutiful, lacked the vitality that might be necessary for long-term happiness. Edward was confronting the complexity of his feelings for Catherine and the potential consequences of allowing those feelings to influence his behavior. And Catherine, though still largely unaware of the deeper currents swirling around her, was beginning to sense that her relationship with her father-in-law was being viewed differently by others than she had perceived it herself. The documentary decision would need to be made soon. The upcoming royal engagements would require careful navigation, and the subtle but persistent media attention would continue to highlight every interaction and analyze every gesture. The silence that had followed Edward's reaching toward Catherine at the gala was proving to be far more revealing than anyone had anticipated, speaking volumes about desires unspoken, connections unacknowledged, and the human hearts that beat beneath the ceremonial duties of royal life. The stage was set for revelations and decisions that would test the very foundations of duty, tradition, and personal happiness within the British royal family. The decision about the BBC documentary had been postponed twice, creating an unusual atmosphere of uncertainty within the palace walls. King Edward found himself in the uncomfortable position of weighing professional obligations against personal complications that he couldn't discuss openly with his advisors. The project would require weeks of filming, including extensive scenes of the royal family working together on charitable initiatives. Exactly the kind of intimate access that could either strengthen public support for the monarchy or inadvertently reveal the subtle tensions that were beginning to fracture the family's carefully maintained harmony. 3 weeks after the charity gala, an unexpected event would force these simmering issues into the open. Princess Catherine had been scheduled to visit a children's hospital in Manchester as part of her education initiative, a routine engagement that would normally generate positive but unremarkable media coverage. However, at the last minute, a scheduling conflict arose that would require the visit to be rearranged or cancelled entirely. James Morrison brought news of the complication to King Edward during their morning briefing, explaining that Catherine's private secretary had called to discuss potential solutions. The original plan had been for Catherine to travel to Manchester alone, but the scheduling change meant that the visit now conflicted with a major parliamentary reception that required her attendance in London. Princess Catherine is reluctant to cancel the hospital visit, James explained, consulting his notes carefully. The children have been preparing for weeks, and several families have adjusted their schedules specifically to meet her. However, the parliamentary reception is also considered essential for maintaining royal relationships with the new government. Edward listened thoughtfully, recognizing an opportunity to provide support for Catherine's charitable work while also spending time with her in a context that would be both appropriate and meaningful. The solution seemed obvious, though he didn't fully examine his own motivations for proposing it. "What if I were to accompany Princess Catherine to Manchester?" Edward suggested. "That would allow her to keep the hospital commitment while also demonstrating senior royal support for her education initiative. We could arrange for a joint visit that would actually enhance the impact of her work." James made notes while considering the logistics and implications of the proposal. From a practical standpoint, it made perfect sense. Joint royal visits often generated more media attention and could significantly amplify the charitable message. The king's participation would also solve the scheduling problem while showing clear family unity and shared commitment to important causes. "I'll coordinate with Princess Catherine's office to discuss the details," James agreed, though he couldn't entirely shake the feeling that this solution might create as many complications as it resolved. When Catherine received word about the proposed joint visit, her initial reaction was one of gratitude and professional excitement. Having King Edward participate in the hospital visit would indeed enhance the impact of her education initiative and provide an opportunity to showcase the broader royal family's commitment to children's welfare. She called Prince William to discuss the arrangement, expecting him to share her enthusiasm for the additional royal support. William's response was more cautious than Catherine had anticipated. While he agreed that his father's participation would benefit her charitable work, he couldn't ignore the growing pattern of Edward's involvement in Catherine's activities and the attention it was generating. "It's a generous offer," William said carefully during their phone conversation. "But I wonder if we should consider how it might be perceived, given the recent media focus on your interactions with father." Catherine was quiet for a moment, processing the implication of William's concern. She had been aware that her relationship with King Edward had attracted some attention, but she had attributed that to the novelty of her taking on more prominent charitable roles and the media's general interest in royal family dynamics. "Are you suggesting there's something inappropriate about working with your father on charitable initiatives?" Catherine asked, her tone betraying a hint of confusion and concern. "Not inappropriate, no," William replied quickly. "It's just that there's been considerable commentary about the warmth of your professional relationship, and a joint visit might intensify that kind of speculation." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with William trying to express his concerns without sounding accusatory, and Catherine attempting to understand what exactly was problematic about collaborative charitable work within the royal family. By the end of the call, they had agreed to proceed with the joint visit, but to be particularly mindful of how their interactions might be perceived and reported. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella was learning about the Manchester arrangement through her own staff channels, and her reaction was quite different from Catherine's initial enthusiasm. Lady Margaret delivered the news during their morning review of the week's schedule, and Isabella immediately understood the implications in a way that Catherine had not. "So His Majesty will be spending the entire day in Manchester with Princess Catherine," Isabella said, her tone carefully neutral as she processed this information. "Yes, ma'am. They're planning to visit the children's hospital together, followed by a reception with local education officials and a tour of one of the primary schools involved in Princess Catherine's initiative." Isabella made a note in her calendar, but her mind was working through the various levels of significance that this joint visit represented. Edward's willingness to rearrange his own schedule to support Catherine's work demonstrated a level of priority that he rarely gave to other family members' charitable activities. The extensive day-long program also meant hours of interaction between them, all of which would be documented by photographers and royal correspondents. "Will there be significant media coverage?" Isabella asked. The palace press office expects considerable interest, given that it's the first major joint engagement between His Majesty and Princess Catherine since the charity gala. The reference to the gala was subtle but unmistakable, acknowledging that this Manchester visit would be viewed as a continuation of whatever had begun that evening. Isabella found herself facing a choice between expressing her concerns about the arrangement or maintaining the dignified silence that had characterized her response to the situation thus far. She chose silence, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the pretense that nothing significant was happening. The Manchester visit took place on a rainy Thursday morning in early November. King Edward and Princess Catherine traveled together in the royal car, spending the 90-minute journey discussing the day's schedule and the broader goals of her education initiative. For Edward, the time in the car represented a rare opportunity for extended conversation without the formal constraints of palace protocol, and he found himself genuinely enjoying Catherine's insights about childhood development and educational policy. Catherine, meanwhile, was struck by Edward's depth of knowledge about social issues and his thoughtful questions about her work. She had always respected him as a monarch and father-in-law, but their conversations during the journey revealed an intellectual curiosity and genuine concern for others that she hadn't fully appreciated before. The hospital visit itself was a tremendous success from a charitable standpoint. Edward and Catherine worked together seamlessly, with Edward's experience and gravitas complementing Catherine's natural warmth and connection with children. The young patients responded enthusiastically to both visitors, and the hospital staff was clearly delighted by the royal attention to their programs. However, it was during the quieter moments between scheduled activities that the most significant interactions occurred. As they moved from one ward to another, Edward and Catherine found themselves walking together, their conversation flowing naturally between observations about the children they had just met and broader discussions about the challenges facing healthcare and education systems. The photographers captured these moments of easy communication, but what they couldn't document was the growing sense of connection that both Edward and Catherine were experiencing. For Edward, Catherine's passion and intelligence were refreshing and inspiring, reminding him of why he had once been enthusiastic about royal service. For Catherine, Edward's genuine interest in her work and his thoughtful perspectives were creating a relationship that felt more personally meaningful than the formal family interactions she had expected. The lunch reception with local education officials provided another opportunity for extended interaction, as Edward and Catherine presented a united front in discussing policy initiatives and funding priorities. Their collaboration was smooth and effective, but observers noted the particular attention they paid to each other's comments and the evident pleasure they took in building on each other's ideas. By the time they visited the primary school in the afternoon, both Edward and Catherine had settled into a comfortable partnership that felt natural and productive. The children at the school responded to their obvious mutual respect and shared enthusiasm, and the educational staff was impressed by their detailed knowledge of current challenges and innovative solutions. However, it was during the final school visit that a moment occurred which would later be analyzed and discussed as evidence of the deepening connection between them. As they observed a literacy class in action, Edward found himself standing close to Catherine. Both of them focused on watching the children work through reading exercises. In a moment of shared delight at a particularly enthusiastic young reader, Edward spontaneously placed his hand briefly on Catherine's shoulder, a gesture of shared pleasure that felt completely natural to both of them. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but it was captured by photographers and observed by several education officials, creating another image that would join the collection of moments that seemed to tell a story about their relationship. The drive back to London was quieter than the morning journey, with both Edward and Catherine processing the day's experiences and the undeniable sense that their working relationship had evolved into something more personally meaningful. Edward found himself reluctant for the day to end, while Catherine was beginning to understand why others had been noting the particular quality of their interactions. "Today was remarkable," Edward said as they approached London. "Your work with those children was truly inspiring." "Thank you," Catherine replied. "Having your support and participation made such a difference. I felt like we were able to accomplish much more together than either of us could have managed alone." The comment was innocent and professional, but it carried undertones that neither of them could completely ignore. They had indeed worked together effectively, but the collaboration had felt more like a partnership between equals than the typical dynamic between senior and junior royals. When they arrived at Buckingham Palace, the usual protocols for ending royal engagements were followed, but both Edward and Catherine were aware that something fundamental had shifted during their day in Manchester. The easy conversation, the natural teamwork, and the obvious mutual respect they had displayed all pointed toward a relationship that was becoming more complex and personally significant than either had originally intended. That evening, as Edward reviewed the positive media coverage of the Manchester visit, he found himself thinking less about the charitable impact and more about the personal satisfaction he had felt working closely with Catherine. The photographs from the day showed two people who clearly enjoyed each other's company and shared a genuine commitment to important causes, but they also revealed a connection that was becoming impossible to characterize as merely professional or familial. Catherine, at Kensington Palace, was having similar reflections as she reviewed the day's events with Prince William. Her description of the visit was enthusiastic and detailed, focusing on the charitable outcomes and the positive response they had received. But William could hear in her voice the same quality that had begun to characterize her discussions of King Edward's work, an admiration and warmth that seemed to go beyond professional respect. And Queen Isabella, reading the newspaper coverage the next morning, saw in the photographs a confirmation of what she had been gradually acknowledging over the past month. The image of Edward's hand on Catherine's shoulder, the obvious pleasure they took in each other's company, and the natural partnership they displayed all spoke to a connection that had moved well beyond the usual boundaries of royal family relationships. The Manchester visit had been a charitable success and a public relations triumph, but it had also marked a point of no return in the complex emotional dynamics that had been developing since that moment of reaching at the charity gala. The silence that had followed that initial gesture was now being filled with evidence of a growing connection that could no longer be dismissed or ignored. The stage was set for confrontations and decisions that would test not only individual relationships, but the very structure of the royal family and the institution of the monarchy itself. The breaking point came on a cold December morning, 6 weeks after the charity gala that had started it all. Queen Isabella had spent a sleepless night wrestling with decisions that she had been avoiding for too long. The morning newspapers lay spread across her private sitting room table, featuring yet another set of photographs from King Edward and Princess Catherine's latest joint engagement, this time a visit to a university research center focused on childhood development. The images told a story that was becoming impossible to ignore or reinterpret. Edward and Catherine stood close together, their heads bent over research documents, their body language speaking of intimacy and shared purpose that transcended professional collaboration. The accompanying articles praised their remarkable partnership and evident dedication to shared causes, but Isabella could read between the lines to see the real story that royal correspondents were beginning to piece together. Lady Margaret entered the sitting room with Isabella's morning correspondence, but paused when she saw the expression on the Queen's face. After years of service together, Lady Margaret had learned to recognize when her employer was grappling with significant personal decisions rather than mere administrative matters. "Ma'am," Lady Margaret said carefully, "shall I reschedule this morning's appointments? You seem to have important matters to consider." Isabella looked up from the newspapers, her usual composure showing signs of strain that hadn't been visible even during the most challenging periods of her royal tenure. "Actually, Margaret, I think it's time for some very frank conversations. Please arrange for me to meet privately with His Majesty this afternoon, and also request a meeting with Princess Catherine tomorrow morning." The unusual directness of Isabella's request signaled to Lady Margaret that a significant moment had arrived. Royal marriages, like all marriages, went through periods of difficulty, but the formal protocols of palace life usually prevented such issues from being addressed with the kind of immediate clarity that Isabella was now demanding. Meanwhile, King Edward was in his study, ostensibly reviewing constitutional papers, but actually contemplating the increasing impossibility of his situation. The Manchester visit had confirmed what he had been trying to deny for weeks. His feelings for Catherine had evolved far beyond appropriate familial affection or professional respect. During their extended conversations about educational policy and charitable strategies, he had found himself genuinely captivated by her intelligence, passion, and commitment to meaningful causes. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. At 68, after decades of dutiful marriage and careful adherence to royal protocols, Edward found himself experiencing emotions that felt both completely natural and entirely forbidden. Catherine represented everything that he felt had been missing from his life: intellectual partnership, shared passion for charitable work, and a warmth of connection that energized rather than drained him. But the implications of these feelings were staggering. Catherine was married to his son, she was a devoted mother and committed member of the royal family, and any acknowledgement of his emotions could destroy not only his own marriage but the stability of the monarchy itself. The institution that had defined his entire life could be irreparably damaged by the very human feelings that he was struggling to contain. James Morrison knocked softly on the study door, carrying news that would force the situation toward its inevitable crisis. "Your Majesty, I've just received a call from the editor of the Times. They're planning to run a feature story this weekend about what they're calling the evolution of royal relationships and modern charitable partnerships." Edward looked up sharply, recognizing the diplomatic language that usually preceded more direct discussions of sensitive topics. "What exactly are they planning to explore in this feature?" "Well, sir, they want to examine how the royal family's charitable work has become more collaborative and personally meaningful in recent years. They're particularly interested in analyzing the partnership between yourself and Princess Catherine and what they see as a model for future royal engagement with social causes." The article itself might be positive and supportive, but Edward understood that any detailed analysis of his relationship with Catherine would inevitably highlight the very dynamics that had been creating such personal turmoil. Media attention that had begun as celebration of effective charitable work was evolving into something more psychologically penetrating and potentially damaging. "They've requested interviews with both you and Princess Catherine," James continued carefully. "They want to explore the personal elements that make your charitable collaboration so effective." Edward felt a familiar weight settling in his chest as he contemplated the impossibility of participating in such an interview without either lying about his feelings or revealing truths that could destroy everything he held dear. The reaching gesture at the charity gala had opened a door to honest acknowledgement of his connection with Catherine, but walking through that door completely would require a courage that he wasn't sure he possessed. That afternoon, Isabella's requested meeting with Edward took place in the blue drawing room where they had held so many formal discussions over the years. But this conversation would be unlike any they had shared during their decades of marriage. Isabella had prepared carefully, knowing that this might be the most important discussion of her royal career. "Edward," she began, her voice steady but carrying undertones of emotion that he rarely heard, "we need to talk honestly about what's been happening in our family over the past few weeks." Edward sat across from her at the familiar mahogany table, recognizing that the moment for diplomatic avoidance had passed. Isabella's direct approach indicated that she had made decisions about how to address the situation that had been building since the charity gala. "I think we both know that your relationship with Catherine has become something more than typical family support for charitable work," Isabella continued. "The question is what we're going to do about it." The directness of her statement was shocking in its clarity, cutting through weeks of careful language and diplomatic circumvention to address the heart of their dilemma. Edward found himself both relieved and terrified to have the truth finally spoken aloud between them. "Isabella," he began carefully, "I want you to know that nothing inappropriate has occurred between Catherine and me. We have maintained complete propriety in all our interactions." "I know that," Isabella replied quietly. "I've never questioned your honor or Catherine's integrity. But honor and propriety aren't the only considerations here, are they? You've developed genuine feelings for her that go beyond what either of you anticipated." The conversation continued for over an hour, with both Edward and Isabella displaying a level of honesty and emotional courage that surprised them both. Isabella acknowledged that their marriage, while dutiful and respectful, had lacked the passionate connection that both of them had hoped to find. Edward admitted that his interactions with Catherine had awakened feelings and desires that he had thought were permanently buried under decades of royal responsibility. The question, Isabella said as their discussion neared its conclusion, is whether we're going to allow these feelings to destroy everything we've built, or whether we're going to find a way to address them that preserves both our personal dignity and the institution we serve. The next morning, Isabella's meeting with Catherine took place in a smaller, more intimate setting, Isabella's private sitting room, where personal conversations were possible in a way that the formal palace reception rooms didn't allow. Catherine arrived uncertain about the purpose of the meeting, but prepared to discuss any royal business that required her attention. Catherine, Isabella began with characteristic directness. I asked you here because I think it's important for us to discuss the situation that has been developing between you and my husband. Catherine's initial reaction was one of confusion and concern. She had been aware that her working relationship with King Edward had attracted media attention, but she hadn't considered that there might be personal implications that required direct discussion with Queen Isabella. Your Majesty, Catherine said carefully, if there's been any impression of impropriety in my work with the king, I want to assure you that our interactions have been entirely professional and appropriate. I'm not questioning your behavior, Isabella replied gently, but I think we need to acknowledge that professional collaboration can sometimes develop into personal connection, even when everyone involved has the best of intentions. The conversation that followed was remarkable for its honesty and mutual respect. Isabella explained her observations about the growing warmth between Edward and Catherine, while Catherine gradually acknowledged that her feelings about her father-in-law had indeed evolved beyond simple professional respect. Neither woman blamed the other for the situation that had developed, recognizing that genuine human connections couldn't always be controlled or predicted. The question, Isabella said, echoing her conversation with Edward the previous day, is how we manage this situation in a way that protects everyone involved and preserves the stability of the royal family. What emerged from these two crucial conversations was not a solution in any traditional sense, but rather a mature acknowledgement of the complex realities they were facing. Edward's feelings for Catherine were genuine and significant, but acting on them would require sacrifices and consequences that none of them were prepared to accept. Catherine's growing connection with Edward was real, but her commitment to William and her children, as well as her dedication to her royal duties, made any dramatic change in her life impossible to consider. Isabella's position was perhaps the most complex of all. Her marriage to Edward had been dutiful rather than passionate, but it represented decades of shared service and mutual respect that couldn't be easily dismissed. More importantly, the stability of the monarchy itself depended on the royal family's ability to present a united front and maintain public confidence in their commitment to duty over personal desire. In the weeks that followed these conversations, subtle but significant changes began to occur in the royal family's dynamics. Edward and Catherine's joint charitable work continued, but with more careful attention to the boundaries between professional collaboration and personal connection. Their interactions remained warm and productive, but both of them maintained a heightened awareness of how their behavior might be perceived and interpreted. Isabella, meanwhile, found herself in the unexpected position of helping to manage a situation that could have destroyed her marriage, but which instead had opened possibilities for a more honest and mature relationship with Edward. Their conversations about Catherine had led to broader discussions about their marriage, their individual needs and desires, and their shared commitment to the institution they served. The reaching gesture that had started everything continued to resonate through their lives, but its meaning had evolved. What had begun as a spontaneous moment of connection had forced all of them to confront fundamental questions about duty, desire, and the price of living life in service to something larger than themselves. The BBC documentary request was ultimately declined, with the palace citing scheduling conflicts and the need to focus on upcoming international commitments. The real reason that the royal family was navigating complex personal relationships that couldn't withstand that level of public scrutiny remained unspoken but understood by everyone involved. As winter settled over London and the royal family prepared for the Christmas season, they had arrived at a new understanding of themselves and each other. Edward's feelings for Catherine hadn't disappeared, but they had been acknowledged and contextualized within the broader framework of royal duty and family responsibility. Catherine had gained a deeper appreciation for the emotional complexities of royal life, while reaffirming her commitment to her marriage and her role within the institution. Isabella had demonstrated a level of grace and wisdom that earned her new respect from both Edward and Catherine, showing that sometimes the most loving response to marital challenges is not jealousy or anger, but honest acknowledgement of human complexity and shared commitment to something greater than individual desire. The silence that had followed Edward's reaching gesture at the charity gala had indeed spoken volumes, but its final message was not about scandal or destruction. Instead, it had revealed the capacity of mature adults to confront difficult truths, navigate complex emotions, and choose duty and family stability over personal gratification. The royal family emerged from this crisis not unscathed, but stronger in their understanding of themselves and their commitment to the institution they served. The reaching gesture would be remembered not as the beginning of royal scandal, but as a moment of truth that ultimately reinforced the values of service, sacrifice, and mature responsibility that defined the monarchy at its best. In the end, the silence that had spoken so eloquently of desire and connection would be answered by choices that spoke even more powerfully of duty, wisdom, and love in its most selfless form.